Hello, my name is Rob Garner. I'm a computer programming instructor, and today I'm going to demonstrate how to make a database in Visual Studio. I'm going to create a new project. It'll be a C# web application. And I'm going to call it database demo and store it on my desktop. And we'll go with the empty web form application. And we can see here we have our new web application. And it already has an app data folder. If you didn't have one, you would have to right click and add ASP.NET folder. And I like to make sure that it's empty. And we're going to add a database. So under data, we're going to pick a SQL Server database, and I'm going to call it employee, or let's just call it personnel DB. This can take a few minutes. And you'll notice that in your app data folder, you then get a database file. If I double click this, it'll open up the Server Explorer and show us the database. And we'll see that most of these tables are empty. To add a table, I'm just going to right click on table and add new table. And here we can see that we are in a page where we can update our table or create tables. So I'm going to create a table, and there's a couple different ways you can do that. You can use the designer up here to create your table, or you can work down here and just, if you know SQL pretty well, you can just write your code to create table down here. I find that that tends to work well, but I'll use the design surface a little bit just to show what the capabilities are. You can also look at your properties, and looks like it's not populated yet, probably because I don't have the table actually created. And some things like renaming the table is easier from here. So I'm going to call this employee. If you're used to using things like putting the type of object name it is before the name of a table, for example, or other item in your database, you can do that. It seems like because of the way different things in the .NET environment work, I find it just works easier just to name your tables like that with just the name and follow the convention of making your table names singular. I'm going to change the ID field to employee ID. And now that I've selected an item, I can get the properties. And for example, with this employee ID, I could also change things in the properties to set things. And one thing that we typically do with identity, we notice that the identity specification is false. And notice what happens down here as I make changes. So if I change this to true, we see that it writes the code for me. So the way to think about these designers and property windows in Visual Studio really is to think of them as basically just code generation objects. You put inputs into these dialogue or these windows, and it just writes code for you. When you open the project up, it looks at the code and generates what it needs to in these forms. So it's just another way of writing code. If I want to add another field, I can use the designer like this. And you'll notice it's writing the code. I can also just write down here and you'll see that it updates the designer. If I want to add a foreign key constraint, I can just write it out here, or I can click on this, add new foreign key constraint. In this case, we're going to make a constraint that sets supervisor ID to point to basically employee ID. And it stubs out the foreign key constraint. You can continue to use some of the feed items here, but if you already know SQL, it's just easier to write it. So I want this to point to employee ID, or so now we have a pretty typical table type of situation. We have an employee. Employees have supervisors. Those supervisors happen to be employees, so we've created a constraint that points to that employee. Once you create your table, then oh, and another thing, notice that there's a key icon here next to the primary key. But once we create our table, what we want to do is update it. It's not in the database yet, so we'll click Update. And it's compiled basically your SQL code, and you can either generate script or update database. We're going to just use update database. And it looks, and if we hit refresh, we can see that we do in fact have that table. So I can close this out. Anytime I click on it, it'll bring the designer back up and show us what the SQL is for that table. The next step is to add a departments table, and we'll add a new table. And we'll go through the same process. And it'll be a department table. We'll have an ID. There's some things I do find easier to stub out with the controllers or with the designer. And that's probably enough for now. So there we have a table, and I'll update. Refresh. We have an employee in a department table. And if we want to update or add data, maybe some data just so we have something for test, we can show table data. And actually, I'm going to update the departments first. And so we now have our department table set. In order to make sure that your inputs get updated, make sure that an ID number is set, and the way you do that is just move off of it, and you'll see that it updated database with that item and provided it an ID field. Similarly, we can add some employees. And if we wanted to go ahead and make Heather the head of these departments, we can just put the index and set those up. And then probably under department, We can set this reference for department head ID. And so we have kind of some typical data that we might have in a database like this. So that completes our demonstration of how to make a database using Visual Studio. Thank you very much.